last week, this is the split that we gave to our consideration, to consider in two parts using these two quotes from the New Testament, just to focus our thoughts on the obedience of Sarah and reciprocation of that in Abraham, and then to move on to consider their faith this week, God willing. And we thought we'd just start with a recap for the benefit of those that weren't here last week, or for those that have just forgotten, just to bring these things back into our thoughts and to link them with what we're going to say today. So we saw that it was a series. These are 2 of 6 talks on Abraham and the relationships that Abraham had with various people in his life. And so last week and this week are focusing on events in Abraham's life that involve Sarah, his wife. I'm going to make sure that we stick purely to those things, because we have other talks on Abraham and Lot, and Abraham and Melchizedek, and Abraham and Isaac still to come. And so we saw that this was a special marriage that we're directed to consider by New Testament commentary, and that provides us with these 2 areas of focus perhaps to look at. So firstly, the obedience of Sarah and her humble subjection to Abraham, her husband, that we looked at last week, and then, as we say, the second aspect is Sarah's faith in God and his promises, in that verse in Hebrews 11 verse 11. But we said last week that there was very clearly a dual aspect to these characteristics to be found in both Abraham and Sarah. They were a reflection of each other, and had some discussion, didn't we? I think it was Brother Chris that mentioned the reference back to Genesis, where there was the very purpose of the woman being created as a help meet for the man, which means as a helper, as a counterpart, and corresponding to him. And that's what we see in Abraham and Sarah, these corresponding characteristics in their lives. And so we looked at a bit of background to set the scene. We won't go through this in any detail, but we saw that Sarah was the half-sister of Abraham. They probably therefore grew up together in the same household, possibly married at a young age. They'd turned from a pagan upbringing. But we saw that Sarah was very fair. She was very beautiful. Everyone that saw her and met her found her beautiful, but her beauty was more than skin deep, as we say. She had a lovely character, and that's what we started to develop last week. But the backdrop to their lives was that they were a couple troubled by a very particular trial for most of their lives, which was Sarah's barrenness and the fact that they were childless. We also mapped what we know of Abraham and Sarah's life together on a timeline. So we just noted that Sarah lived 127 years, Abraham 175 years, and that Abraham was 10 years older than Sarah. We know that from the fact that when Isaac was born, Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 90. And most of what we know of Sarah and Abraham was this latter half of their lives. And the focus of the chapters, we looked at this, if we zoom in on that period from when we first read of Abraham and Sarah departing Haran in chapter 12, or the very end of chapter 11 of Genesis, through to chapter 21, it's just a period of 25 years of their lives. And there's a focus even in those chapters. So there's 5 chapters from chapters 12 to 16 that refer to those first 11 years, and then there's a gap, and then these other 5 chapters that refer purely just to one year, really, up to the birth of Isaac. And we notice that Sarah doesn't figure in all those chapters, but we'll come back to that again. And so then we looked at this reference in 1 Peter 3 and verse 16, which was the focus of our thoughts, and saw that Sarah's mentioned in that chapter as an example of a submissive wife in the Lord. And so the characteristics that she portrayed, as outlined in that chapter, was that she was a wife in subjection to her husband. She was of respectful and pure conduct. She wasn't concerned with external beauty, despite the fact that she was a beautiful woman. It was the development of a meek and a quiet spirit, as is described in those verses there, that Sarah was an example of. And she was an example of one who trusted God. Then we look back in Genesis chapter 18 to the event that Peter was referring to when he quoted those words, and we saw that the calling of Abraham, her Lord, was something that she did in her heart. It was how she felt about him deep down inside, her true feelings about him. And we saw that was reciprocated as well in Abraham, that had similar feelings for Sarah in his heart, thinking her of that mother of nations that she was promised to be. And so he was an example of a husband that gives honour to the wife, as is the other side of the example in 1 Peter chapter 3. And so then we looked at 4 events in the lives of Abraham and Sarah where we see that meek and honourable obedience of Sarah shown towards Abraham. As we just mentioned, didn't we, how the constant upheaval of removals and journeys and sojourning, and saw the various places that they lived and travelled to in their life, how that stressful that must have been for a wife of any sort, making that constant move. But then we looked more specifically at the submission and obedience of Sarah in Egypt when she was taken into Pharaoh's house, and she did that to protect Abraham. Saw the humility that she suffered in giving Abraham to her handmaid Hagar. It was a desperate attempt to try and provide this child for her husband in that way. And then we considered briefly at the end of our remarks the entertaining of the angels in Mamre and how they worked together willingly and generously. And so in all that we saw the characteristics, the righteous partnership developing between Abraham and Sarah. And so now we hopefully will continue that and to build on that this week. And we're considering their faith and its development and its coming to fruition in their lives in this second part. So focusing on this quote in Hebrews as our thought that through faith also Sarah herself received strength because she judged him faithful who had promised. Sarah also, as well as Abraham, of course, they were both examples of faith. And so that's where we'll start, really, just with an overview. Go back to our this chart that we were referring to of these years that we read about of Abraham and Sarah, and just very loosely plot on there the 4 quotes that we have in the New Testament that speak of Abraham's faith, and we see that he demonstrated faith throughout his life in various aspects. And so we have the reference in Hebrews 11 and verse 8. By faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out not knowing whither he went. So faithful from the start, had faith. Romans 4 verse 16 again speaks about the faith of Abraham. And in verse 19, being not weak in faith, he considered not his own body, now dead, when he was about 100 years old, neither yet the deadness of Sarah's womb. He staggered not at the promise of God through unbelief, but was strong in faith, giving glory to God. In Hebrews 11 verse 17, a bit later, referring to his offering up of Isaac, by faith Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac. And then also in that chapter, by faith he sojourned in the land of promise, is in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. They're not supposed to point directly to the very years when these things happened, but we just see this throughout Abraham's life, these references to his faith in various aspects of his life. And so in these matters very clearly stated, we see he showed faith throughout his life, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. He was a righteous man. Although, as we inferred last week, he was a righteous man, he was a very faithful man, but still he was a human being, and so therefore we might expect to see occasional weaknesses in his character possibly. But we made the point, of course, that the scriptures certainly don't condemn Abraham for anything, so we have to be careful if we're doing that, don't we? And that would follow again in Sarah's life as well. Again, as we saw last week, she was a very genuine example of a loving and a submissive wife, and it would seem that she had a strong belief in God. But there was a matter, it seems, where it took her faith a little time to develop, and it's in the matter of her barrenness and her apparent inability to bear the child of promise. And so there's just one New Testament reference to Sarah's faith, and that's in Hebrews chapter 11, and it points us to this very specific point in her life, which was the conception, the birth of Isaac. As seems to be indicating then that was where Sarah's triumph of faith occurred. So Hebrews 11 verse 11, through faith also Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed and was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. And so maybe there's an inference that she was just a little bit behind her husband Abraham in her faith, and that this is when it really all happened for her. And that's, I suppose, the things that we're going to be considering today in the chapters that we look at. It's all about this focus in this time of their lives. And this marvellous realisation that that Sarah herself would have a son with her husband Abraham, and that therefore she would be a mother of a great nation. She came to realise that they would indeed be heirs together, which is another feature of the husband and wife that are being referred to as examples by the Apostle Peter in 1 Peter chapter 3. We'll refer briefly to that a little later. But this all happened in a short space of time, as we say. We'll just come back again to this chart and make the point again. I think we've made it before, but so these on the left, these are the chapters that Sarah and Abraham feature in. So we have chapter 12 when they depart Haran, and they're travelling there to Egypt and back again. But that's all in a space of around a year. And then we have this 11-year gap before we read about them again in chapter 16 of Genesis, when Hagar bears Ishmael. And then we have a 13-year gap, and then we read about them again, all in this space of about a year, where lots of things happen in chapter 17 through to chapter 21. And we're going to look at some of these events today, and we've already looked at some. So chapter 17 is where the covenant's renewed, where we read that chapter just a moment ago. Chapter 18, where they entertain the three angelic visitors. You've also got the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in chapter 19. It doesn't involve Sarah and Abraham. Chapter 20, Gerar, with events with Abimelech. And then chapter 21, the conception and the birth of Isaac. But all this is focused into this 1 year period. And it really is an eventful year where Sarah's faith flourished. And we can't read those verses there, but in Genesis chapter 17 and at verse 1, we clearly read there that it was when Abraham was 90 years old and 9 that the Lord appeared to him. So he was 99 there. And it was in Genesis 21 and verse 5 when Abraham was 100 years old, when his son Isaac was born unto him. So there's only a year between these events. And it's referred to in Genesis 17 verse 21 as well, isn't it? Where God says, my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at this set time in the next year. So there's just a year where all these marvellous things will happen. And that's the marvellous year that we're going to consider today. So with the scene set, let's consider some of the relevant events and the words of these few chapters of Genesis, as we look to see their faith flourishing in these matters. So we've just read Genesis chapter 17, or most of it, and the covenant renewed here. And we just wanted to pick up, so we can't deal in great detail with all these chapters, but we just really wanted to pick up and focus on the fact that it's really only now in this chapter, we know the promises are revealed to Abraham from Genesis 12 and Genesis 15, they're renewed time and again, aren't they? But it's only really in this chapter here, in chapter 17, that it seems that God is making absolutely clear that the seed promised to Abraham is a promise that involves Abraham and Sarah as heirs together, as we mentioned that quote from 1 Peter 3 verse 6, that they realise that the promised seed is one that involves both of them, that both have an equal part as parents of this promised son. And that doesn't seem to have been recognised previously, does it? So they've been through this process. Abraham, at first, in Genesis chapter 15, he thought, well, the seed must be coming because Sarah's barren, we're not having a child, we haven't had for many years. So the seed must be through one born in my house, and he thought it was through a son of his steward Eliezer, but God told him no, it's not through Eliezer. And so then we have the events of chapter 16 where Sarah thought, well, it must be through Abraham, but through Hagar, because I can't bear myself. And we considered that last week, and we saw that that didn't have a good result. That wasn't the purpose of God to provide this seed through Hagar. And so now we come to Genesis chapter 17, in which he elaborates and confirms that his purpose is with both Abraham and Sarah. That Sarah has a complete involvement in these things, and that's outlined in this chapter. Let's perhaps just read a few verses again. The verses that refer very specifically to Abraham and the verses that refer specifically to Sarah, and we see the correlation between them. So Genesis 17 and verse 3, that Abraham fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. Neither shall thy name any more be called Abraham, but thy name shall be Abraham, for a father of many nations have I made thee. And I will make thee exceeding fruitful, and I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee. And let's just jump ahead now to verse 15. So we've had this renaming of Abraham and these things that have been said, and we see a very similar thing, don't we, of Sarah. So verse 15, that God said unto Abraham, As for Sarai thy wife, thou shalt not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall her name be. And I will bless her, and give thee a son also of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be of her. And so we have this marvellous correlation, don't we, that through Abraham he was going to be a father of nations. His name would be changed from Abraham, lofty father, to Abraham, father of nations, of a multitude. And similarly for Sarah, her name would be changed from Sarai, meaning my princess, to Sarah. It's a very subtle change, but Sarah just meant princess, a princess of others as well, not just Abraham's wife Sarah, his princess, but a princess, a mother of nations. They were both to be ancestors of royal progeny. Almost the same things were said of them. Kings shall come out of thee, was said to Abraham, and kings of people shall be of her, speaking of Sarah. And God said, I will make thee exceeding fruitful, to Abraham. And he said of Sarah that I will bless her and give thee a son of her. So it's unequivocal now, isn't it, that it's being outlined very clearly here in this chapter that this promised seed would come from both Abraham and Sarah by no other means. It was to come from them, the father of many nations and the mother of many nations. So we just want to say, as we go along, something about the laughter that's mentioned of both Abraham and Sarah. There are 3 instances of it recorded of Abraham and Sarah. So one is in this chapter, in chapter 17, where Abraham laughs. And then there are 2 other instances where Sarah laughs. One in chapter 18 and one in chapter 21. We'll come to them all eventually. But the first instance, as we say, is in chapter 17 here, where Abraham laughed on hearing these things promised, confirmed to him again in this great detail, in this almost unequivocal, as we say, undeniable language that God uses to describe that the seed would come through both himself and his wife Sarah. And so we read it in verse 17, don't we, that Abraham fell upon his face and laughed, and said in his heart, Shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old, and shall Sarah that is 90 years old bear? I was looking at the Hebrew. This word laughed here is this Hebrew word sulkak. And it's a root that means to laugh outright, but there's 2 aspects to it, 2 sides to it. It's either in merriment or scorn. By implication, to sport, to laugh, mock, play, make sport. And it appears 13 times in Genesis. We've just put the note there that it's the same word that is used when Sarah laughs in chapter 18. And then there's this other word, we've just put it here just to complete the picture. It's almost an identical word. As you can see from the actual Hebrew letters, the only thing is some tiny vowel points that are slightly different. And so it has a very similar meaning of laughter. Again, in pleasure or derision, has two aspects to it. And there's just two occasions where that exact word is used, and one of them is in Genesis 21 of Sarah. But I don't think it makes any difference as to which word is used. It seems to me that it's just a word that the only difference between the sense is only determined by the context of the chapter, not by the words itself, as to whether it's the senses of merriment and pleasure or whether it's a sense of derision and scorn. We have to determine that from the context. And I think that in the context, in chapter 17 here, this is Abraham laughing in pleasure, in appreciation of what he's just been told. But I think perhaps in Sarah's case it's different, but we'll come to that. But we see here from the context in Genesis chapter 17 that Abraham now understands the extent of the involvement of his wife Sarah in the promise, and understands that from this new name that she has, and overcome with joy therefore, falls on his face, laughing inside at this marvellous prospect. Let's just read it again. And Abraham fell upon his face and laughed, and said in his heart, shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old, and shall Sarah that is 90 years old bear? And I think we have confirmation of that in the reference that we've already quoted from Romans chapter 4 and verse 20, where it clearly says in reference to this event in Abraham's life that he staggered not in disbelief. He staggered not at the promise of God through unbelief, but was strong in faith. So I think for me that seems to imply that this was overcome with joy and appreciation of this fact that he now is fully convinced and understands that despite all the physical signs being to the contrary, that he will have this promised son with Sarah. But perhaps he's slightly ahead of Sarah in that appreciation. So we'll move on to chapter 18. Keep going chronologically, but we will say a bit more about this laughter as it comes up again, God willing. So in chapter 18 we have the angelic visitation, although it appears they don't know that they were angels when the visitors first came to them. But we picked up on this last week and looking at the aspect of Sarah's willing submission to Abraham in entertaining their visitors and how they worked together in doing that. But now perhaps we look at the purpose of the visit, because the purpose of this visit of these strangers was all to do with Sarah. Let's just pick up in Genesis 18 and verse 9 and the dialogue between these visitors and Abraham. So verse 9, they said unto Abraham, where is Sarah thy wife? And he said, behold, in the tent. And he said, I will certainly return unto thee according to the time of life, and lo, Sarah thy wife shall have a son. And Sarah heard it in the tent door which was behind him. And so as we say, it's all about Sarah, this message, isn't it? And she hears this stranger using this new name, Sarah. And then we have in verse 11 a bit more information as it continues. Now Abraham and Sarah were old and well stricken in age, and it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. I think that's really significant, isn't it? And it just adds to the trial, I think, that it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So throughout these many years of barrenness and their hope to have this son of promise that they've been promised so many times over the years, all the signs were there that Sarah should have been able to bear, but now even those had ceased. And so on that basis then we read in Genesis chapter 18 and verse 12 that Sarah laughed at what she had heard. So Genesis 18 verse 12, therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I am waxed old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also. And so in the context, because I say I think it's only the context that can tell us the sense of this laughter. But it doesn't appear to be the same laughter as that of Abraham. There definitely will be a time, the next time Sarah laughs, I think, when it is laughter of joy, when she both most definitely laughs for joy and appreciation of what's been promised. But perhaps the fact that she laughs twice is an indicator that wasn't the case this time. Because all the signs were that these were just visitors that didn't even know her. The time of life now, even the physical signs that she might have been able to bear have now gone. And now she hears someone say that they would have a son, a child. And so the record continues then, doesn't it, with some dialogue then between Abraham and then Sarah also. So in verse 13, the Lord said unto Abraham, wherefore did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I of a surety bear a child which am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the time appointed I will return unto thee, according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. Then Sarah denied, saying, I laughed not, for she was afraid. And he said, nay, but thou didst laugh. And so verse 14 seems to be another clue in the context, doesn't it, behind Sarah's laughter, that she laughed within herself. The angel knew exactly her thoughts, and so we have them here. And perhaps his question provides that reason when he says, is anything too hard for the Lord, implying that was the problem, that Sarah thought this was beyond belief. It's not possible that could be the case. She didn't yet have that faith that Abraham did, that she could bear a son in her old age. But then, as verse 15 is perhaps the first sign that Sarah's realisation that perhaps there's more to it than this. These aren't just strangers, just travellers. There's more to it. They know too much almost, don't they? And so she denies. And Sarah denied, saying, I laughed not, for she was afraid. And he said, nay, but thou didst laugh. And so it implies, doesn't it, that whereas she first thought there was no possibility that this could happen, the fact that she denies perhaps suggests otherwise, that she's having second thoughts. But if she was still having doubts, then she would have said when questioned, yes, I did laugh, because there's no way it's possible. That's not what happened, was it? She denied because I think there was this realisation perhaps that this was angelic representation from God, and that she was realising that there was this possibility. Well, there's more laughter to come from Sarah, as we say, in a couple of chapters' time, so we'll come to that in not too long. We want to just work chronologically as we go through, so perhaps just moving now to Genesis chapter 20, because Genesis chapter 19 is all about Abraham and Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah. So we have the events in Genesis chapter 20 of Abraham and Sarah sojourning in Gerar. And there seems to be some significance in what happens at the end of these events, in this realisation of Sarah and this real final triumph of her faith. So remember, this is all happening in a short space of time, in a 3-month space of time, in all the things that we've considered so far. And so we find in chapter 20 then Abraham and Sarah leaving Hebron at the beginning of the chapter. They've probably been there for about 20 years now. Perhaps this was as a result of all the destruction around and of Sodom and Gomorrah. But they move south again, virtually repeating the circumstances that we considered last week when they went into Egypt. We don't really want to get into the rights and wrongs of that situation again, but let's just briefly consider, just outline some of the events, just to bring us to the end of the chapter, really. So they come to Gerar. There's this process again where they claim to Abimelech that Sarah is Abraham's sister. That seems to be what they agreed. We considered that last time, didn't we? That would be the case because of Sarah's beauty and the risk attached to that for Abraham. But God appears to Abimelech in a dream and reveals Sarah's true identity to him in verse 3. But in verse 6, he suffered Abimelech not to touch Sarah. And God tells Abimelech to restore Sarah to Abraham and to ask Abraham to pray for him so that they might live. And then there's some dialogue between them, but they come to an amicable agreement as we come to the end of the chapter. But it's at the very end of the chapter, in chapter 20, that we find some additional information with regard to the plague that it says that God sent upon Abimelech's house, probably similar to what he did to Pharaoh's house in Genesis 12 and the circumstances we considered last week. But we're told specifically what God did in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 17. So Abraham prayed unto God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife and his maidservants, and they bare children. For the Lord had fast closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. So it's perhaps significant, isn't it? There's the trial that Sarah and Abraham had borne throughout their life was that of barrenness and the closing of the womb. And here, at the end of this chapter, in chapter 20, is God having closed the wombs of Abimelech's house. But then this prayer of Abraham to open the wombs again. Maybe this was a very pivotal moment of realisation at the moment of the triumph of her faith by Sarah, that if she could see that Abraham's prayer had the power to open wombs again, obviously God's power ultimately, then surely God could open her own womb, that she could bear the son of promise. It's highly likely, isn't it, if Abraham's praying for wombs to be opened, that they would have both prayed together fervently at this time. Again, for no doubt it was a constant prayer of theirs, that they could bear the promised son. And so it seems that now, at this stage where they were both believing with all their hearts, the fruition of God's plan came about. So Genesis 21 and verse 1, the very next words that we read after this event where God has closed and opened the wombs of Abimelech's house, we read that the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken. And so here's the point in time now that Abraham's faith is now matched by his wife's, by Sarah's, that she now believes herself. It had to be the case, didn't it, that she believed herself that she could have this son when past age. That's what we understand from Hebrews 11, verse 11, isn't it? That it was through faith. Also, Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed and was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. So she definitely had faith now that that could be the case. At this stage in her life, Sarah herself believed, and so her faith is now equivalent to Abraham's, her husband's. She's fully persuaded that God was able to produce of them a son. And so that has marvellous consequences. It makes Sarah laugh again. And as I say, we think this laughter is different to her previous laughter. The previous laughter was laughter within herself, incredulity, that these strangers could suggest that she could have a child. But now this is laughter because she appreciates and understands and has great faith in the promise that has been made to her. And so we read in verse 6 of chapter 21 that Sarah said, "God hath made me to laugh, so that all that hear will laugh with me." And so this here, again in the context, is laughter of joy at the fulfilment of the promise. No longer that laughter of incredulity. But it's the same laughter, I think, that Abraham had originally, because he staggered not at the promise before his wife Sarah, only a few months before, but perhaps it had taken her just those few months longer. And so it's the same word again, this word laugh. I suppose we just put some extra down the bottom of the box this time, just to show that this is one of the two instances where this slightly different word, seacoke, is used of Sarah. But as I say, I don't think there's anything in the word itself, because the other example of that word being used is in Ezekiel 22 verse 32, where it says, "Thou shalt be laughed to scorn and had in derision." So clearly that is the opposite aspect to this laughter. So as I say, I don't think it means that was what Sarah's laughter was. It just can't be in the context, can it? I think this laughter is all determined by the context, and it's now laughter of joy by Sarah at the fulfilment of this promise and her genuine belief in it. So I wanted to say a couple of other things about this laughter of joy and the change in the situation now in these words of Sarah in chapter 21. We perhaps see a quite nice echo of Sarah in Mary. Both, of course, mothers of promised sons by miraculous means. And there's just these parallels that we've just tried to highlight and point out. I'm not sure if that colour shows up very well there, but we see in Genesis 21 and verse 1 that it was God had given his word about this thing, and that it was done, and it was the same, wasn't it, of Mary, as we read in Luke 1 and verse 38. That Mary said, "Behold, the handmaid of the Lord, be it unto me according to thy word." This was something that God had spoken. He had given his word that these faithful women would have these sons of promise, and it was achieved by the miraculous means, by the angels visiting. And then in Genesis 21 verse 6 to 7, perhaps comparing those with Luke chapter 1 verse 45 and 46, we see the outcome of these marvellous things was that God caused joy and laughter in these women, that these things that were promised, marvellous things that were promised, did happen as was said. So Genesis 21 verse 6, that Sarah said, "God hath made me to laugh." And Mary said in Luke 1 verse 46, "My soul doth magnify the Lord, and my spirit hath rejoiced in God my Saviour." That's what these things that's what obviously they did for these faithful women, but they should do the same for us, shouldn't they? They cause us joy because these promised sons were born, both Isaac as the seed of Abraham and Sarah, and the ancestors of the great nation that was to come, of promise, and of course the Lord Jesus. And that's perhaps the aspect that we'll just continue to see and have a look at just for a few moments now, how these things can start to relate to us. So we see these two women, as we say, of similar character, rejoicing in faith at the fact that they'd been blessed by God, and that they would have these sons that would mean that many generations to come would also be blessed. But it was only when these women came to the moment of realisation and truly believed in faith that the performance of these things would follow. I think that was the case for both Mary and Sarah. So let's just say something about this laughter, and perhaps the things that might be prefigured in that, the things that it makes us think about. So these words in Genesis 21 verse 6 and 7 of Sarah, that Sarah said, God hath made me to laugh, so that all that hear will laugh with me. And she said, who would have said unto Abraham that Sarah should have given children suck? For I have borne him a son in his old age. And there's perhaps something significant in what Sarah carries on to say here, isn't there, in verse 7. It's a very small thing, but perhaps demonstrate the extent now of her understanding and of her appreciation of the promise that was made through her and her husband. Because she speaks, she's marvelling now at the prospect that she should have given children suck. She's speaking in the plural, not just her son Isaac, but she's recognising that there's far more to it in this child of promise. Her thoughts have gone beyond her own son Isaac to the promised multitude of people that God has been referring to in his promise to them. People born by the same principle as Isaac, by the operation of God's power in their lives, in a different sense, but it's the operation of the Spirit in our lives, isn't it, that means that we can become those children of promise. But Sarah recognises that Isaac is but the beginning of this multitude to follow. And the scriptures speak of prophetically of the glorious future flourishing of Zion. Perhaps look at Isaiah chapter 54. We've got the words on the screen actually, which perhaps have an echo back to Sarah in these things, speaking of the future joy for this multitudinous offspring to come. In Isaiah 54 verse 1, sing, O barren, thou that didst not bear, break forth into singing and cry aloud, thou that didst not travail with child. For more are the children of the desolate than the children of the married wife, saith the Lord. Perhaps not immediately obvious, is it? I had to read it a few times, but maybe it's just me, just to make sure I'm understanding what's being said here. But this children of the desolate surely is referring to the children of this barren woman, the one that didn't bear, the one that didn't bring a child forth. But everything would change. Compared to a married wife that was fruitful, this previously barren woman would bear with this multitudinous offspring. The tables would be turned. They would ultimately be more numerous than the children of an apparently fruitful wife. That's perhaps the sense that we get from these things, isn't it? That speaks, points forward, and should cause us great joy as well in our consideration of these things. And perhaps continues. I knew we had one that wasn't on the screen. If you perhaps turn to Isaiah 66 and just see another similar reference to the future, the spiritual sons and daughters of Zion, perhaps prefigured in a sense by Sarah, in the sense that the land that was previously barren of spiritual sons and daughters will become fruitful in a marvellous way. So Isaiah 66 and verse 9. So God says, shall I bring to the birth and not cause to bring forth, saith the Lord? Shall I cause to bring forth and shut the womb, saith thy God? Rejoice ye with Jerusalem, and be glad with her, all ye that love her. Rejoice for joy with her, all ye that mourn for her, that ye may suck and be satisfied with the breast of her consolations, that ye may milk out and be delighted with the abundance of her glory. For thus saith the Lord, behold, I will extend peace to her like a river, and the glory of the Gentiles like a flowing stream. Then shall ye suck, ye shall be borne upon her sides, and be dandled upon her knees, as one whom his mother comforteth. So will I comfort you, and ye shall be comforted in Jerusalem. Marvellous words, aren't they, that contemplate this future time when Zion will bring forth her children, and when all the world will be delighted at this event. This marvellous analogy being of a child comforted and dandled on the knees of its mother. All from a womb that was previously shut is the context there, isn't it? Well, let's just move quickly on to try and come to the end. We have some more words of Sarah to consider. We're not going to consider them in any detail, but they're in Genesis chapter 21, and it's all about this So let's just read these words. Genesis 21 and verse 9. That Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, which she had borne to Abraham, mocking. There's that same word again. It's that same word, sorkak. So here it's translated mocking. Previously we've seen it translated as laughter. But again, in the context, this is mocking of derision, isn't it, and of scorn. It was something that wasn't pleasing to Sarah. And so verse 10, wherefore she said unto Abraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac. And the thing was very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son. And God said unto Abraham, let it not be grievous in thy sight because of the lad, and because of thy bondwoman. In all that Sarah hath said unto thee, hearken unto her voice, for in Isaac shall thy seed be called. So there's quite a lot in there, and we haven't got time really to go in any detail. But what do we perhaps make of this incident? Because it's clearly concerns Abraham and Sarah very, very deeply, and their relationship between each other. So we just put a few points on the screen. We know that Sarah is an example of a pure and a submissive wife who honoured her husband, and so for that reason we know that the motive must have been good. This wasn't just something she did out of spite or jealousy. That wouldn't fit with the character that we know she had. What we see here is that what Sarah said was supported by God. God says to Abraham in verse 12, hearken to her voice. So it couldn't have been wrong, could it? Her words, Sarah's words, are quoted by Paul as scripture in Galatians chapter 4. He says, what saith the scripture? And quotes her words, cast out the bondwoman and her son. And that's because Sarah was right in what she said, wasn't it? It was Isaac that was the promised seed. That was the whole the main thing that they've come to realise and appreciate, and now they had their son, and so that was the right thing to do. And it was motivated by Sarah's desire to bring up her son in a godly environment, to cast out anything that was scornful to the truth that would oppose her son. And so time is gone, so we just want to move on to our conclusion, really. We've seen, hopefully, although very quickly, having to rush through some of these things, but we've seen Abraham and Sarah as marvellous examples in terms of obedience, of giving honourable submission to each other, and certainly of faith and of being heirs together of the promises. There's just another reference to Abraham and Sarah in the Old Testament that we'd like to just use to bring our thoughts to a conclusion in Isaiah chapter 51. Again, it's the one on the screen there. God gives us some very clear instruction concerning Abraham and Sarah. Isaiah 51 verse 1, he says, hearken to me, ye that follow after righteousness, that seek the Lord. So if we want ourselves to be amongst those people that follow after righteousness, this is what we have to do. Look unto the rock whence ye are hewn, and to the hole of the pit whence ye are digged. Look unto Abraham your father, and unto Sarah that bare you. For I called him alone, and blessed him, and increased him. So we're being told, aren't we, very clearly, that if you want to know what following after righteousness looks like, and seeking the Lord looks like, then look to Abraham and to Sarah, for they were examples of this. And then again the record continues there with a picture of what's on offer for those that do so. Verse 3, for the Lord shall comfort Zion, he will comfort all her waste places, and he will make her wilderness like Eden, and her desert like the garden of the Lord. Joy and gladness shall be found therein, thanksgiving and the voice of melody. And so here's a vision, a picture of a previously barren land, waste places, wilderness and desert place that's literally transformed and will flourish in the future. And that will only happen because of the flourishing and the fruitfulness of Abraham and Sarah eventually by the hand of the Lord, so that they might have that family, and that we might be part of that family as children of the promise, counted for that seed. And so that's really where we wanted to conclude rather. In Genesis chapter 23 we read of the end of Sarah's life where she was buried, and Abraham bought the cave of Machpelah, and then in chapter 25 when he died he was buried in the same place. And it perhaps just makes us think, doesn't it, that one day, and we hope very soon, that cave, like all graves of the faithful, will be opened, and Abraham and Sarah surely will laugh again when they see their seed and that multitudinous nation that has come from them. And may it be in God's mercy and his grace that we might be with them there and be some of those children of promise.